Hi, this is Kelsey Fikowski, and in this video, we're literally going to take the entire AP Gov curriculum and speed through it. This is not meant to be an exhaustive review, but it really highlights some of the major concepts you should know, as this is really cramming for the very, very last minute. So remember, in Unit 1, we discussed various theories of democracy, everything from the elite model to hyperpluralism to pluralism, and we established our first U.S. Constitution known as the Articles of Confederation, but this gives too much power to the state government over the national government. For example, no figurehead. Today's rebellion is going to expose these weaknesses, and as a result, we're going to devise the U.S. Constitution that we have today. We're going to have various compromises, including the Three-Fifths Compromise, as well as the Great Compromise, which is going to establish two chambers in Congress, that being the modern-day House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, it's important to know that the way that the smaller states are going to ratify, meaning make legal this new Constitution, is through the Bill of Rights being ratified into the U.S. Constitution. Now, be aware of the various types of federalism. Now, in our Constitution, we have the 10th Amendment, which is the bedrock of federalism. Be aware of dual federalism prior to the 1930s, cooperative federalism, which is going to be ushered in around the time of FDR, and then fiscal federalism, which is going to be ushered into the 70s and 80s. Now, remember, the main idea here, the ongoing theme that we still have today, what is the appropriate scope of power between the national and state government? That is still being sorted out today. All right, Unit 2. Be very familiar between major differences in terms of powers between the House and the Senate. For example, the House has exclusive powers to introduce bills that deal with revenue. So that's why they have the Ways and Means Committee. Also be aware of the Rules Committee. In terms of the Senate, be aware that they carry a lot more power in terms of ratifying treaties, confirming appointments to ambassadors, judicial appointments. Very, very important to know. In terms of also the House and the Senate, keep in mind how they have to work jointly with the stages in a bill. So remember the importance of the committee system as well as the House structure. The most powerful person in the Senate is the Senate Majority Leader. Remember that the most powerful person in the House is the Speaker of the House, and all of these leaders together need to work with the president to get legislation that they want passed. And that becomes very difficult when you have divided government. Now, in terms of the executive branch, we really see this as a relatively weaker branch originally, but over time we're going to see the executive branch gain a lot of power, especially since FDR. But certainly some of the formal powers to be aware of, Commander-in-Chief, for example. Also remember that the president has to provide a State of the Union. Also remember that the president has a lot of appointment power over ambassadors and especially the judicial branch. But importantly to know, here are informal powers, for example, executive privilege as well as executive orders, making arguably the executive branch the most powerful branch, especially because of war powers. Definitely be aware of the struggle between the Congress and the executive branch with respect to the War Powers Act. Very important to know that. In terms of the judicial branch, really the main thing to know is Marbury v. Madison is going to establish judicial review. Without this power, the judicial branch would be very, very weak. And then we have the bureaucracy, technically part of the executive branch, but keep in mind that they are the action figures of government. So when Congress passes legislation, the bureaucracy has to implement it, and sometimes they have a lot of authority, and this is called discretionary authority. Make sure you know that. Sometimes bureaucracies are left to their own devices and have a lot of power to make rules, enforce rules. So think of, for example, the FAA, FCC, SEC, those types of agencies where they have more technical expertise, and sometimes they are operating really without Congress and the executive branch really having too much control over them. But it's important to note that most of this exam in many respects is really a checks and balances exam. Know the checks on the judicial branch, the executive branch, and legislative branch. Very important. I would also be familiar, what are the checks on the bureaucracy from all three here as well. Know these checks. If you have to know anything, I would be very familiar with the interactions here. All right, let's go into Unit 3, Civil Rights versus Civil Liberties. Really the bedrock of this unit is the 14th Amendment because it contains two important clauses here. The Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, and these relate to civil rights and civil liberties. Anytime we're talking about civil rights, we're talking about the Equal Protection Clause. We're literally trying to make equal conditions for laws to be applied to everyone fairly. With civil liberties, we're talking about all people's rights. So think more specifically, the first 10 amendments are Bill of Rights. And anytime that we're really dealing with that and we're going to extend the Bill of Rights to all 50 states, we will be using the Due Process Clause. And that brings us to a very important concept known as selective incorporation, that the federal government really is, of course, has to pay attention to the Bill of Rights, but the Supreme Court is going to rule that they do not apply to the states, and that was not the Founding Fathers' intention. So if they are going to pertain to all 50 states, they have to literally be selectively incorporated, either amendment by amendment or aspect of each amendment. For example, the First Amendment contains 5 different powers there, or 5 different rights, and they each have to be selectively incorporated over time. Not all amendments have been incorporated, but a good example of one being the Second Amendment in the McDonald v. Chicago case. So definitely know your amendments, especially the first 10. That will really, really help you out. And I do have a video link posted should you want to know those in very easy ways. Also important to know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. This is going to establish civil disobedience, and this is going to be instrumental in the ultimate passage in terms of civil disobedience being an effective strategy for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in terms of getting passed. So very much important to know these various aspects of Unit 3. Now going into Unit 4, political socialization, we are talking about various influences and factors, mainly being the family, that is going to really determine your political ideology. Now in terms of liberal, conservatives, and libertarians, very important to know in this unit, whereas liberals want more government intervention when it comes to the economy, for example, regulation, but they want less government intervention in terms of social areas. A big thing prior to 2013, 2014 was when gay marriage was illegal in many states. Liberals tend to want the government out of social policy. Of course, they also are more favorable to having really fewer restrictions when it comes to abortion. When it comes to economic policy, right, liberals tend to favor higher taxations on corporations as well as high earners. Conservatives, on the other hand, want less economic intervention by the federal government and state governments for that matter, lower taxes, and they believe that is the best way in terms of supply side economics and in terms of stimulating the economy. In terms of social issues, for example, they do tend to favor more restrictions on abortion, tend to be anti-Roe v. Wade, and tend to be okay more than liberals, that is, in terms of more government intervention on social issues. And libertarians, for the most part, are really government stay out of my life in terms of social and economic policy as much as possible. So keep in mind that liberals tend to align with Democrats, conservatives tend to align with Republicans, and libertarians also tend to align with Republicans, but they probably would not like that label. Also in this unit, we talked about public opinion and measuring it. This is very important because this informs our congressmen and women, as well as the president, as to how they should perhaps align themselves when voting. Is this an issue that really matters? What do my constituents mean? It's important to note that when polls are conducted, for example, that you need to have random sampling techniques. You have to also be aware of the margin of error. You also want to have a high sample size. And when I say high, I mean really only 1,000 to 1,500 really for in conjunction of random sampling to really have a higher confidence of 95% or higher in those data set. So very important to note that you're likely to see some type of question dealing with interpreting data from Unit 4. So be aware on that for the one part of the FRQ. Now going into Unit 5, various factors influencing voter turnout. Of course, the more partisan you are, the more likely you are to turn out to vote. It's also important to note weather can impact. Also your political efficacy. Do you think that you actually your vote actually matters? If you don't, you have a low voter efficacy. Also, think about different demographics in terms of how they vote, men versus women. Women tend to be more Democratic, men tend to be more Republican, and that's what we call the gender gap. Younger people also tend to be more liberal and Democratic, whereas older people tend to be more conservative and Republican. Now, when we talk about models of voting behavior, for example, think about retrospective voting, where a voter will think, what has this candidate or what has this person who's in office done for me over the past 2, 3, 4 years, versus a prospective voter who's going to think in the future in terms of, well, what could this candidate do for me? And remember, economics tends to be the number one reason as to the influence as to how somebody's going to vote. You also have rational choice, and you also have party line voting. Now, when it comes to third parties, really they encounter a lot of barriers, especially at the national level. You have ballot access laws. You also have wasted ballot syndrome, where people think voting for this person or this party really is going to be a waste of my vote. But they do serve an important function as they give Americans an extra choice. They also serve as a safety valve for people's discontent. But third parties are like bee stings, right? When they come up with a new innovative idea, they sting the two major parties. But then what happens to the bee because it stung you? It dies. So that there's a big problem there. Also, single member districts is a big issue with third parties as well. Now, in terms of interest groups, they are very pivotal in terms of influencing legislation. They oftentimes will hire lobbyists. They also will try to organize various groups of voters along their interests. Remember, with interest groups, they are singly motivated by one particular interest, whereas a political party has various stances on economic policy, social policy, foreign policy. Interest groups have just one policy, and that's just their interests. So they will utilize, and I'll skip down here to campaign finance, PAC funding. That's very influential, especially if a congressman or woman is on a high-ranking, important committee here. In campaign finance, the floodgates are going to be open thanks to Citizens United with super PACs. We do have some regulation. Definitely important to know FICA, and with respect to that's really the big turning point where we have some type of oversight in terms of election campaign finance thanks to the FEC. So be familiar with that along with PACs and how that influences various members in our government. Now, in terms of elections, congressional elections, really less attention is paid to, but keep in mind that incumbency is the number one factor that gets people reelected after time after time after time again. They tend to be smaller, have less media coverage. They tend not to attract the most notable people, whereas with presidential elections, on the other hand, right, that's going to be followed much more closely. A lot more money is going to be spent. And of course, we have that pesky electoral college, where this is an indirect system of electing the president. Every other election under the, aside from this, is a direct election. You are literally voting for that person. With a presidential election in the Electoral College, you are not. So be familiar with some of the advantages and disadvantages of the Electoral College. And then last but not least here, with the media's roles, keep in mind that they serve various functions here, from the gatekeeper, scorekeeper, the agenda setting effect. Wow, very important to know the agenda setting effect as they set what's important in the news. We don't know what's going on in Washington, D.C. because we're not there, but the media is there, and they have to report on the issues that they think is most pertinent to us. And sometimes they are known as the fourth branch of government, and because of their watchdog function. So I've just sped through units 1 through 5, but it's important to also note that you need to know these foundational documents. I do have a link underneath should you want to consult, and I would also be familiar with these SCOTUS cases. These are the cases that you need to know, be familiar with specific clauses or the end result, because you will see at least one pop up, probably more, especially during the FRQ portion. So even though this was only around 13 minutes, I hope this was very helpful, but there are more detailed videos on my channel should you wish to check out. I hope this is helpful, and best of luck on the AP Gov exam.